On October 25, 1927, Jack Warner stood at the back of the Warner's Theater in New York City and watched the audience react to sound. Not music, they'd heard music before, synchronized to film. Sound. Voices, Al Jolson speaking dialogue in The Jazz Singer. The first feature-length talking picture, the moment that would change cinema forever. The audience erupted. They'd never heard an actor's voice emerge from the screen, never heard dialogue match movement. The technology worked. The gamble paid off. Warner Brothers, the scrappy studio built by four Polish immigrant brothers, had just revolutionized Hollywood. Jack should have been celebrating with his brothers, but Sam Warner, the brother who'd championed the sound technology, who'd convinced Jack and Harry and Albert to bet everything on it, was dead. He died the day before, pneumonia following an infection, 40 years old, in Los Angeles, while his brothers were in New York for the premiere he'd made possible. Jack watched the audience cheer, he absorbed the triumph, and he went home that night knowing he'd just lost the only brother he truly loved. The Warner estate in Beverly Hills, the legendary 9-acre compound that would become one of Hollywood's most famous addresses, didn't exist yet in 1927. Jack was still living modestly, still sharing studio profits equally with his brothers, still functioning as part of a family business. But Sam's death changed everything. It removed the peacemaker, the brother who could mediate between Jack's ambition and Harry's morality, the one person who could keep the family together. Over the next 3 decades, Jack would build an empire. He would acquire neighboring mansions and demolish them to expand his estate. He would construct a 9-hole golf course, tennis courts, a pool the size of a small lake. He would host the most legendary parties in Hollywood history. Clark Gable, Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart playing cards in the game room, presidents and royalty visiting for dinner. He would also betray Harry so completely that his oldest brother would suffer a heart attack upon learning what Jack had done. He would fire his own son from the family studio. He would skip Harry's funeral. He would die isolated, powerful, and alone. The Warner estate wasn't just a mansion, it was a monument to what Jack won and what he destroyed to keep it. If you enjoy explorations of grand historical properties and the complex stories behind them, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which property you'd like me to explore next. Your support makes these deep dives possible, and I read every comment. Thank you for being here. Now let's begin with 4 brothers from Poland who arrived in America with nothing and built one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood history, until ambition destroyed what poverty couldn't. The Warner brothers, Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack, were born in Poland to Benjamin and Pearl Warner. Benjamin was a cobbler. The family was Jewish, living in an era and region where that meant pogroms, discrimination, and limited opportunity. In 1889, they emigrated to North America, first to Canada, then to Baltimore, then to Youngstown, Ohio. They were poor, not romantically poor, desperately poor. Benjamin cobbled shoes. The children worked whatever jobs they could find. The American dream wasn't handed to them. They had to build it from scrap. Harry was the oldest, born in 1881. Serious, moralistic, deeply religious. He became the family patriarch after their father, the one who held everyone accountable. Albert, born 1884, was the businessman. Quiet, organized, good with numbers. He managed distribution and sales. Sam, born 1887, was the visionary. He saw potential where others saw risk. He was gentle, diplomatic, optimistic, the brother everyone liked. Jack, born 1892, was the youngest, charming, ruthless, hungry. He wanted success with an intensity that made him dangerous to anyone in his way, including family. In 1903, the brothers scraped together enough money to buy a film projector. They traveled through Ohio and Pennsylvania showing movies in rented halls, mining camps, anywhere people would pay a nickel to watch. It worked, not spectacularly, but enough to keep going. By 1905, they opened their first theater in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, the Cascade, 99 seats. They showed short films, charged 5 cents admission, a Nickelodeon. Harry ran operations. Albert handled money, Manson managed the projector and scouted new films. Jack, only 13, sang illustrated songs between reels, popular entertainment before talking pictures. They opened more theaters. By 1907, they had several across Pennsylvania. By 1910, they were distributing films to other theaters. By 1912, they'd moved to California to start producing their own films. Warner Brothers Pictures, Inc. was incorporated in 1923. Four brothers, equal partners. They weren't the biggest studio. MGM, Paramount, and United Artists dominated, but they were growing, scrappy, willing to take risks the majors wouldn't. In 1925, Sam became fascinated with a new technology, Vitaphone, sound synchronized to film. Other studios dismissed it as a gimmick. Sam convinced his brothers to invest everything. They didn't just bet on sound. They mortgaged the studio, took on massive debt, risked bankruptcy. If it failed, they'd lose everything. In 1926, they released Don Juan with synchronized musical score. It was successful enough to continue. In 1927, they prepared The Jazz Singer, not just music, but dialogue, voices, the first feature-length talking picture. Sam worked himself to exhaustion making it happen, installing sound equipment in theaters, negotiating with exhibitors, solving technical problems. He was 40 years old, running on adrenaline and ambition. In October 1927, days before the New York premiere, he collapsed. A sinus infection had spread. Pneumonia. His body, weakened by overwork, couldn't fight it. He died on October 5, 1927, one day before The Jazz Singer premiered and changed cinema forever. Jack was in New York for the premiere. He didn't return to Los Angeles for the funeral. Some accounts say he was too devastated to face it. Others suggest he chose the premiere over his brother. Either way, the pattern was established. The work came first. The Jazz Singer made Warner Bros. A major studio overnight. The film grossed over $3 million, astronomical for 1927. More importantly, it forced every studio in Hollywood to adopt sound technology. Silent films became obsolete within 2 years. Theaters had to install sound equipment or close. Actors who couldn't speak clearly lost their careers. Warner Bros., which had been a mid-tier studio, suddenly controlled the future because they'd taken the risk, because Sam had seen it coming. By 1928, Warner Bros. Was one of the big 5 studios dominating Hollywood, alongside MGM, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, and RKO. The brothers became wealthy, not just comfortable, wealthy in the way that changes everything about how you live. Harry remained in New York, overseeing distribution and finance. Albert handled sales and exhibition. Jack moved to Los Angeles to run production, the creative side, the glamorous side, the side that got invited to parties. And Jack loved parties, loved being seen, loved the power that came with controlling which actors got roles, which directors got hired, which stories became films. In 1926, even before The Jazz Singer premiered, Jack bought property in Beverly Hills. Not a mansion yet, just land, a place to build. He was married to his first wife, Irma, at the time. They'd married in 1914. She was from a wealthy family, the opposite of Jack's impoverished childhood. They had one son, Jack Jr., born in 1916. The marriage was already deteriorating. Jack was ambitious, social, constantly working or socializing. Irma wanted stability, family, privacy. By the late 1920s, they were living separate lives in the same house. In 1933, Jack began an affair with Anne Boyar, a beautiful young woman 23 years his junior. She was everything Irma wasn't: glamorous, social, ambitious, willing to be seen on Jack's arm at every industry event. Jack divorced Irma in 1935. It was brutal. The settlement gave her the house, significant alimony, and custody of Jack Jr. Jack didn't fight for his son. He wanted the divorce clean and fast so he could marry Anne. He married Anne in 1936. She was 23, he was 44. And she wanted a proper estate, not the modest house he'd shared with Irma, something that announced Jack Warner's arrival as one of Hollywood's most powerful men. The Warner estate, as it came to be known, was built in stages between 1926 and 1937. The original purchase in 1926 was a relatively modest Spanish-style house on Angelo Drive in Beverly Hills. Jack had lived there with Irma and their son. When he divorced Irma, she got that house. Jack bought the property next door. Then he bought the house behind it, then the one next to that. Between 1935 and 1937, he acquired 4 adjacent properties in Beverly Hills' most exclusive neighborhood. He didn't renovate them. He demolished them. 3 mansions, perfectly functional, were torn down so Jack could expand his estate. The lots were cleared and incorporated into a single 9-acre compound. On the main lot, Anne oversaw construction of a new mansion. Not Spanish this time. Anne hated the Spanish clunker Jack had lived in with Irma. She wanted Georgian, grand, formal, the kind of house that British aristocrats built, adapted for Southern California. While Jack was at the studio one day in 1936, Anne had construction crews literally tear the facade off the existing house and begin rebuilding it in Georgian style. Jack came home to find his house being demolished and reconstructed. He loved it, because it meant Anne was invested, that she wanted to build something with him that erased his past and represented their future. The new mansion was completed in 1937. The final cost ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars, equivalent to millions today. 2 stories, white columns, symmetrical design, a grand entrance hall with a sweeping staircase, drawing rooms, dining rooms, a library, a game room, a screening room for private film viewings. The bedrooms upstairs included a master suite for Jack and Anne, guest rooms for visiting stars and executives, and servants' quarters. Outside, a swimming pool the size of a small lake, tennis courts, manicured gardens designed by landscape architects, and Jack's signature addition, a 9-hole golf course. Not a putting green, a full 9-hole golf course, regulation length, professionally maintained, because Jack loved golf, and why travel to a country club when you could tee off in your backyard? The estate employed a full staff: gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, maintenance workers. Operating costs ran thousands of dollars per month. Annual property taxes alone exceeded what most Americans earned in a year, but Jack could afford it. By the late 1930s, Warner Bros. Was producing dozens of films annually. Jack's salary as head of production, plus his share of studio profits, made him one of the wealthiest men in Hollywood, and the estate announced that wealth to everyone who visited. The numbers clarify what narrative often obscures. The Warner estate eventually encompassed 9 acres in Beverly Hills. For context, most residential lots in Beverly Hills are quarter acre. Jack's compound was 36 times larger than a standard lot. The main house, approximately 13,000 square feet, 23 rooms across 2 floors, 8 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, multiple living spaces, a screening room that seated 50. The swimming pool, approximately 100 feet long, 50 feet wide, Olympic-sized, heated, with a pool house containing changing rooms and a bar. The 9-hole golf course, each hole ranged from 120 to 450 yards. Total yardage, roughly 2,800 yards. Not championship length, but legitimate golf. Tennis courts, 2 regulation-sized courts, clay surface, professionally maintained and lit for night play. Staff. Estimates vary, but the estate employed approximately 20 to 30 people full-time: gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, drivers, maintenance workers, golf course groundskeepers. Annual operating costs. Difficult to determine precisely, but contemporary accounts suggest upwards of $50,000 per year in the 1940s. In today's terms, roughly $800,000 annually. Property taxes. Beverly Hills assessed the property at hundreds of thousands of dollars. Tax rates in the 1940s to 1950s meant annual property taxes of $10,000 to $15,000. In today's terms, roughly $150,000 to $225,000 annually. The guest list over the years reads like a who's who of Golden Age Hollywood: Clark Gable, Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Bette Davis, Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Joan Crawford. Directors like John Huston and Howard Hawks, moguls from other studios, politicians, royalty visiting Los Angeles. Jack hosted legendary poker games in the mansion's game room. Stakes were high. Thousands of dollars changed hands in a single night. The games lasted until dawn. Scotch flowed.
Cigars were smoked, deals were made. The estate wasn't just Jack's home, it was a tool, a place to impress actors he wanted to sign, to host executives from New York, to demonstrate that Warner Bros. Had arrived as a major power. Every party, every dinner, every golf game served a purpose. Jack didn't do anything that wasn't strategic, including, eventually, betraying the brothers who'd built the studio with him. For decades, the Warner Brothers maintained an uneasy partnership. Harry ran the business from New York. He controlled finances, negotiated distribution deals, made strategic decisions about expansion and acquisition. He was moralistic, conservative, deeply opposed to excess. Jack ran production from Los Angeles. He chose which films to make, which stars to hire, which directors to employ. He was creative, social, willing to take risks Harry found reckless. They fought constantly. Harry treated Jack like a child who couldn't be trusted. Jack resented Harry's control and moral judgments. They communicated primarily through angry telegrams and shouting phone calls. But they needed each other. Harry understood business, Jack understood entertainment. Together, they'd built one of Hollywood's most successful studios. Albert, the middle brother, tried to mediate, but he lacked Sam's diplomatic skill. Sam had been the one who could calm tensions, find compromises, remind them they were family. Without Sam, the fights intensified. By the 1950s, all three remaining brothers were aging. Harry was in his 70s, Albert in his late 60s, Jack in his 60s. None of them had sons interested in running the studio. Jack Jr. worked there, but Jack had no intention of giving him real power. The studio was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The brothers owned it equally, or close to equally, with Harry holding slightly more shares as the eldest. In 1956, Jack saw an opportunity. A syndicate led by investor Serge Simonenko approached Jack privately. They wanted to buy Warner Bros. Jack pretended to consider it, then he went to Harry and Albert with a proposal. All three brothers should sell their shares to the syndicate. They'd each make tens of millions of dollars. They could retire wealthy and let someone else deal with the headaches. Harry was 75, tired. He'd fought with Jack for decades. The idea of selling and retiring appealed to him. Albert felt the same. He was 72, ready to step back. They agreed. In 1956, the three brothers sold their shares to the syndicate for approximately $20 million. In today's terms, roughly $200 million. But Jack had made a secret deal. Immediately after the sale closed, Jack bought back his shares and additional shares from the syndicate. He became the largest shareholder and president of Warner Bros. He hadn't retired, he'd maneuvered his brothers out of the company. Harry and Albert learned about it from Variety. The trade publication reported that Jack Warner had returned to Warner Bros. As president and primary owner. Harry, reading the news in his New York office, suffered a massive stroke and heart attack. He was hospitalized for weeks. When he recovered enough to speak, he told friends and family that Jack's betrayal had nearly killed him. The brothers never spoke again. Not once. Not when Harry's health deteriorated. Not when Harry died in 1958, 2 years after the betrayal. Jack didn't attend the funeral. His own brother, the man who'd built the business with him, who'd fought with him but never abandoned him, who'd been there from Nickelodeon's in Pennsylvania to Hollywood dominance. Jack stayed in Los Angeles. He sent flowers. The estate grew more lavish after Jack consolidated control. No longer answering to Harry's financial conservatism, Jack spent freely. The gardens were redesigned. The pool was enlarged. The golf course was regrassed with premium turf. The house was redecorated. Anne oversaw many of these improvements. She was in her 40s by the late 1950s, still beautiful, still social, still determined to maintain the estate as Hollywood's premier entertaining venue. Jack was in his 60s, at the peak of his power. He controlled one of the Big Five studios. He decided which films got made, which actors became stars, which executives advanced, and which got fired. He was also increasingly isolated. His relationship with Jack Jr. had been strained for years. Jack Jr. worked at Warner Bros., but his father gave him minimal authority. He was VP of production, a title without power. Every decision went through Jack Sr. In 1967, Jack fired his son from the studio. The reasons were complicated. Jack Jr. had pushed for more creative control. He challenged his father's decisions. And Jack Sr. couldn't tolerate that, not from employees, not from executives, and especially not from his son. Jack Jr. left Warner Bros. And tried to build a career elsewhere in Hollywood. The Warner name opened some doors, but everyone knew Jack Sr. wouldn't help him, might actively hinder him. Father and son met only once more before Jack Sr.'s death, a brief, cold encounter that resolved nothing. By the late 1960s, Jack was learning what Harry had known. Betrayal has consequences. In 1967, Jack sold Warner Bros. To Seven Arts Productions for $32 million. He stayed on as studio head under the new ownership, but by 1969, conflicts with the new owners forced him out. The man who'd betrayed his brothers to keep control of the studio lost control anyway. 11 years after Harry's death, 11 years after the betrayal that had destroyed their relationship. Jack was 77 when he left Warner Bros. He'd run the studio for over 40 years, and now, suddenly, he had nothing to do. He still had the estate, still had Anne, still had wealth, but he didn't have the work, didn't have the power, didn't have the calls from actors begging for roles or executives seeking approval. He'd spent his entire life building an empire, and in the end, it pushed him out anyway.
In the 1970s, Jack and Anne still hosted parties at the estate, but they were smaller now. The legendary poker games had ended, the A-list actors were working for other studios, the directors had moved on. Jack was no longer the most powerful man in Hollywood. He was a retired mogul, respected but irrelevant. He played golf on his 9-hole course, he watched films in his screening room, he walked the gardens Anne maintained obsessively. He was lonely, not financially, he had millions, not socially, Anne ensured they were invited to every important event, but existentially. He'd sacrificed every relationship that mattered for power, and now the power was gone. Harry dead since 1958, Albert dead since 1967, Sam dead since 1927, the brothers who'd built Warner Bros. With him, all gone, and Jack had attended none of their funerals except Albert's. Jack Jr. was alive but estranged. They barely spoke. The son Jack had named after himself, the heir who should have inherited the studio, had been cast out. What remained were acquaintances, business relationships, people who'd benefited from Jack's power and stayed in his orbit out of habit or residual gratitude. Anne was there. She'd been with him for over 40 years by the late 1970s. She managed the estate, organized their social calendar, maintained the facade of normalcy. But Jack was increasingly aware of what he'd lost. Not the studio, that was always temporary, always subject to the whims of investors and market forces. What he'd lost were the people who'd known him before he was powerful, the people who'd loved him without calculation. In September 1978, Jack died of heart failure at age 86. He died at the estate he'd built, surrounded by luxury, attended by servants, with Anne at his side. But his son wasn't there. His brothers were long dead. The studio he'd controlled for decades no longer bore the Warner family's direct involvement. He'd wanted success more than anything. He'd achieved it, built a mansion, hosted presidents, produced hundreds of films, made millions of dollars. And he'd destroyed everyone who'd helped him build it.
The Warner estate didn't stay in the family long after Jack's death. His will left the bulk of his estate, approximately $15 million, to Anne. Jack Jr. received a smaller inheritance, controlled by trusts. The message was clear even in death. Jack trusted his wife more than his son. Anne lived in the estate for a few more years, but maintaining a 9-acre compound required constant work and enormous expense. The staff, the gardens, the golf course, the pool, all of it needed money and attention. In 1980, Anne sold the estate to David Geffen, the music and film mogul, for approximately $5 million. In today's terms, roughly $18 million. Geffen lived there briefly, then sold it in 1990 to Rupert Murdoch for several million more. The estate had appreciated significantly. Beverly Hills real estate always did. Murdoch never lived there full-time. It was an investment property, a trophy, a place to host occasional events. By the late 1990s, he'd moved on to other properties. The estate changed hands several more times over subsequent decades. Each sale broke records. Each new owner made modifications, updating bathrooms, modernizing kitchens, installing contemporary technology. But the core remained. 9 acres, Georgian mansion, pool, tennis courts, golf course. The bones Jack and Anne had built in the 1930s. The estate exists today as one of Beverly Hills' most valuable properties, worth over $50 million at current market rates, maybe more depending on the buyer. Tour guides in Beverly Hills sometimes drive past and point it out. That's the old Warner estate. Jack Warner, the movie mogul, lived there, hosted all the big stars. They don't usually mention the betrayals, the estrangement, the funeral Jack skipped, the son he fired, the brothers he destroyed. Because those details complicate the glamour, and glamour is what people want when they tour Beverly Hills.
There's a photograph of Jack Warner from the 1950s standing on the estate's lawn. He's in his 60s, dressed in golf attire, club in hand. Behind him, the mansion rises white and elegant. The gardens are immaculate. The sky is California blue. He looks satisfied, like a man who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. And he had. The estate, the studio, the power, the wealth, everything he'd dreamed of as a poor kid in Ohio watching his father cobble shoes. What the photograph doesn't show, Harry, dead 2 years after Jack's betrayal, Jack Jr., pushed out of the family business, Sam, dead 30 years, never seeing what the studio became. The photograph shows success, but success is just what's visible, what you can photograph and display and point to as evidence of achievement. What the photograph can't show is what Jack paid for it. Not in dollars, that's quantifiable. In relationships, in trust, in the possibility of being known by people who'd loved him before he had anything to offer. By the time that photograph was taken, Jack had already lost all of that. He just hadn't realized it yet. Or maybe he had, and he'd decided it was worth it. Because that's the calculation some people make. Power over connection, achievement over relationship, legacy over love. Jack made that calculation repeatedly, when he chose the premiere of The Jazz Singer over Sam's funeral, when he divorced Irma and erased her from his life, when he betrayed Harry and Albert, when he fired Jack Jr. Every time he chose the thing that gave him more control, more power, more status, and every time he lost something he couldn't rebuild. The estate was his monument to those choices, 9 acres of proof that he'd won, that he'd risen from poverty to build something grand and beautiful and permanent. But monuments are for other people to admire. The person they commemorate doesn't get to enjoy them. They're already gone. What Jack built at the Warner estate wasn't just a house. It was a performance. The mansion, the gardens, the golf course, all of it was designed to impress, to make visitors understand that Jack Warner had arrived, that Warner Bros. Was a major power, that Jack himself was someone who mattered. And it worked. The estate became legendary. Everyone in Hollywood knew about it. Getting invited to Jack's parties meant you'd made it. Playing golf on his course meant you were in his circle. Being photographed at his pool meant the press considered you important. But performance is exhausting. You can't stop. Because the moment you stop, people realize it was never real, that the persona you projected was constructed, maintained, and fundamentally separate from who you actually are. Jack performed confidence, authority, charm, success. For decades, he performed the role of Hollywood mogul so convincingly that it became his identity. But late at night, walking through the empty mansion after a party ended, what did he feel? Satisfaction? Loneliness? Both? We can't know. Jack didn't leave introspective diaries. He didn't write memoirs exploring his inner life. He left films,
business records, and a mansion. What we do know is that he kept building, kept expanding, kept acquiring. The estate grew over decades because Jack could never quite have enough proof that he'd succeeded. One house wasn't enough. He needed 9 acres. One pool wasn't enough. It needed to be Olympic-sized. Tennis courts weren't enough. He needed a golf course. Each addition was another piece of evidence, another thing he could point to and say, "Look what I built. Look what I achieved. Look at me." But who was he trying to convince? Hollywood? His brothers? Himself? Maybe all three. Maybe he understood that success is fragile, that it requires constant reinforcement, that the moment you stop building, people start questioning whether you ever had it at all. The estate was proof. Tangible, physical, undeniable proof. And Jack needed that proof right up until he died.
The betrayal of Harry and Albert in 1956 was the defining act of Jack's later life. Everything before it, building the studio, surviving the transition to sound, navigating the studio system's golden age, was accomplished with his brothers. They fought, they disagreed, but they were partners. Everything after it, Jack's reign as sole power at Warner Brothers, his eventual ouster, his isolated final years, happened alone. The betrayal wasn't spontaneous. Jack planned it carefully. He negotiated with the syndicate in secret. He convinced Harry and Albert to sell without revealing his true intentions. He waited until the sale closed before buying back his shares. This required calculation, lying to people who'd known him for decades, exploiting their trust and their weariness. Harry had been fighting with Jack for 50 years. He was tired. The idea of selling and retiring appealed precisely because it meant he wouldn't have to fight anymore. Jack used that exhaustion against him. When Harry learned the truth, that Jack had tricked him, that Jack now controlled the studio alone, that their partnership was over, the emotional impact was physical. The stroke and heart attack were real. Harry's doctors said the shock had triggered the medical crisis. Jack knew this. He knew his betrayal had nearly killed his brother, and he didn't apologize, didn't try to make amends, didn't visit Harry in the hospital. He stayed in Los Angeles, at the estate, running the studio he'd taken. That's the part that's hardest to understand. Not the betrayal itself. Ambition makes people ruthless, but the absolute coldness afterward, the refusal to acknowledge what he'd done or express any regret. Harry died in 1958. Jack didn't attend the funeral, didn't eulogize him, sent flowers. Flowers for the man who'd been there since the beginning, who'd helped build Warner Brothers from Nickelodeon's to one of Hollywood's Big Five, who'd been his partner for over 50 years. What do you say about someone who does that? That he was a monster? That's too simple. Monsters don't build studios or produce great films or charm actors and presidents. That he was ruthless? Closer. But ruthlessness suggests someone who does what's necessary without emotion. Jack's betrayal wasn't necessary. Warner Brothers was successful. The brothers could have continued their partnership or found an equitable way to transition. Jack did it because he wanted sole control, because he couldn't tolerate sharing power, even with family, even with the people who'd helped him build everything he had. That's not ruthlessness. That's something darker. A willingness to destroy relationships not out of necessity, but out of pride, out of the need to prove he could. The estate stood as monument to that choice, because Jack built it bigger and grander after the betrayal, as if the 9 acres and golf course and Olympic pool could justify what he'd done, could prove it was worth it. Jack Jr. grew up in the shadow of his father's ambition. Born in 1916, he was Jack's only child from his first marriage. He watched his parents' marriage deteriorate, watched his father's affair with Anne, watched the divorce and his father's immediate remarriage. He was 19 when Jack married Anne, a woman only 4 years older than Jack Jr. himself. The age difference between father's new wife and son was uncomfortable. The dynamic was strange. Jack Jr. joined Warner Brothers in the 1930s, working his way through various departments. He was intelligent, capable, interested in film production. He wanted to learn the business his father controlled. But Jack Sr. never gave him real authority.
made him vice president of production in title, but restricted his decisions. Every major choice went through Jack Sr. Every creative dispute was settled by Jack Sr. Jack Jr. spent decades working for his father without ever being trusted by him. Why? Possibly because Jack Sr. saw his son as a threat, someone who might eventually take over, diminishing Jack Sr.'s control. Or possibly because Jack Sr. genuinely didn't think his son was capable, didn't believe Jack Jr. had the talent or vision to run Warner Brothers. Or possibly because Jack Sr. was incapable of mentoring. He'd clawed his way up from poverty. He'd fought his brothers for control. He'd betrayed them to consolidate power. Generosity and trust weren't in his vocabulary. In 1967, after tensions reached a breaking point, Jack Sr. fired Jack Jr. from Warner Brothers. His own son, the heir who should have inherited the studio, gone. Jack Jr. was 51 years old. He'd worked at Warner Brothers for over 30 years, and his father pushed him out. They met only once more before Jack Sr.'s death in 1978. A brief encounter, formal, cold, nothing resolved. When Jack Sr. died, Jack Jr. attended the funeral, unlike Jack Sr., who'd skipped his own brother's funeral. But Jack Jr. inherited relatively little. The bulk of the estate went to Anne. Jack Sr.'s will sent a final message. He trusted his widow more than his son, even in death, withholding what Jack Jr. might have expected or hoped for. Jack Jr. lived until 1995, working in independent production, never achieving the success or recognition his father had. The Warner name opened some doors, but Jack Sr.'s reputation for ruthlessness closed others. He carried the weight of his father's rejection for decades, never fully escaping it, never quite establishing an identity separate from being Jack Warner's son. That's what ambition does to families. It creates hierarchies where love should be. It turns sons into rivals. It makes fathers into tyrants who can't yield power even to their own children. The estate, meanwhile, passed to people with no connection to the Warner family. Geffen, Murdoch, subsequent buyers who knew the property's value, but not its cost.
Let's return to the parties, because they reveal something about what the estate meant. In the 1940s and 50s, Jack's parties were legendary, not just in attendance, though the guest lists were extraordinary, but in purpose. Every party was strategic. Jack didn't host for fun. He hosted to negotiate, to impress, to consolidate relationships that benefited Warner Bros. An actor considering signing with another studio would be invited to dinner. They'd be seated next to Cary Grant or Bette Davis. They'd see the estate's grandeur, the ease with which Hollywood's elite gathered there. The message? Sign with Warner Bros. And this could be your life. Directors weighing offers would be invited for golf. Jack would play 9 holes with them, talking casually about projects, budgets, creative freedom. By the 18th hole, they'd have committed to Warner Bros. Executives from New York, studio higher-ups, investors, board members would visit for weekends. They'd be shown every luxury. They'd see how Jack lived, how he entertained, how comfortable he was in his power. And they'd return to New York convinced that Jack Warner knew what he was doing, that Warner Bros. Was in good hands, that investment in the studio was investment in success. Every element was calculated. The menu, prepared by professional chefs, tailored to guests' preferences. The guest list, curated to ensure the right people met, talked, and made deals. The timing, parties often coincided with film releases, award season, or contract negotiations. Anne managed much of this. She was the perfect partner for this kind of entertaining. Beautiful, charming, socially skilled. She knew who to seat next to whom, how to keep conversations flowing,
when to intervene and when to let dynamics develop naturally. Together, Jack and Anne turned the estate into a machine for generating influence and profit. But there's something melancholy about it, because these weren't friendships, they were transactions. The laughter was real, the conversations engaging, the atmosphere pleasant, but underneath, everyone knew why they were there. Jack was using them, and they were using Jack. Actors wanted roles, directors wanted projects, executives wanted assurance their investments were sound, and Jack wanted control over his studio, over his industry, over his reputation. The estate facilitated all of it. The mansion was beautiful, but it was also a tool. The golf course was luxurious, but it was also a negotiating space. The pool was impressive, but it was also a backdrop for photographs that would appear in magazines reinforcing Jack's status. Nothing was just what it appeared to be. Everything served multiple purposes. That's what ambition does. It turns everything, homes, relationships, leisure, into means to ends. When Jack lost control of Warner Bros. In 1969, the parties didn't stop immediately, but they changed. The urgency disappeared. The strategic purpose evaporated. By the 1970s, the estate hosted smaller gatherings, friends, or what passed for friends among people who'd built relationships on business. Nostalgia parties, where aging moguls and stars reminisced about Hollywood's golden age. The machine had run out of fuel. The tool no longer had a purpose. What remained was just a house. Grand, beautiful, expensive, but just a house.
In 1975, 3 years before his death, Jack gave an interview to a journalist researching Hollywood history. The journalist asked about the estate, about how Jack had built it, what it meant to him. Jack talked about the architecture, the Georgian style Anne had chosen, the golf course, his pride and joy, the pool where so many stars had swum, the screening room where he'd previewed hundreds of films. He talked about the parties, the deals made, the relationships forged. He mentioned Cary Grant's charm, Clark Gable's presence, Bette Davis's intelligence. The journalist asked about his brothers, about building Warner Bros. Together. Jack's tone shifted. He acknowledged they had worked together, said Sam's death was tragic, mentioned that he and Harry had disagreed on many things. He didn't mention the betrayal, didn't discuss Harry's stroke or the estrangement or missing the funeral. The journalist, who'd researched the history, asked directly, "Do you regret how things ended with Harry?" Jack paused, then said something like, "Business is business. Harry understood that." But Harry didn't understand. Harry died believing his brother had betrayed him for greed and ego, died angry and hurt. Jack's answer revealed everything. Even in his 80s, reflecting on his life, he couldn't admit regret, couldn't acknowledge that maybe the betrayal wasn't worth it, that maybe he'd sacrificed something irreplaceable for something temporary. Because admitting regret would mean admitting the estate, the power, the control, all of it, wasn't worth what he'd paid. And Jack couldn't do that. His entire identity was built on the idea that he'd made the right choices, that success justified everything, that winning was all that mattered. To admit regret would be to admit his life had been misdirected, that he'd optimized for the wrong things, that he'd ended up wealthy, powerful, and alone when he could have ended up less wealthy, less powerful, and surrounded by family. So he didn't admit it. He defended his choices until he died. The estate stood as physical evidence that he'd been right. 9 acres, Olympic pool, golf course, Georgian mansion, all of it proving he'd succeeded. But success at what? Building something beautiful? Yes. Achieving power? Yes. Creating a legacy? Arguably. But also destroying his relationship with his brothers, estranging his son, living his final years isolated from everyone who'd known him before he was powerful. The estate couldn't answer which mattered more. It just sat there, expensive and empty of the people who'd helped build what paid for it. After Jack's death in 1978, Anne lived in the estate alone for 2 years.
The mansion was too large for one person. The staff still maintained it, but the halls echoed. The screening rooms sat dark. The golf course was played by groundskeepers keeping it in shape, not by Jack teeing off at dawn. Anne was in her 60s, still beautiful, still social, but the estate had been designed for entertaining at scale, for hosting Hollywood's elite, for projecting power. Without Jack, it was just expensive to maintain. She sold it in 1980. The sale made news. David Geffen, one of Hollywood's rising powers, buying the Warner estate. A generational transfer. Old Hollywood giving way to new. Geffen renovated, updated the interiors, modernized systems, but he kept the bones, the Georgian facade, the pool, the golf course, the elements that made it the Warner estate. He didn't stay long. By 1990, he'd sold to Rupert Murdoch, another mogul, another man who'd built a media empire and wanted a trophy property to show for it. Murdoch made his own changes, more updates, more modernization. The estate was becoming a palimpsest, layers of owners, each leaving their mark while preserving what made it valuable. But here's what's interesting. None of the subsequent owners lived there the way Jack did. None of them hosted the kinds of parties Jack hosted. None of them used it as a tool for power the way Jack did. Because the world had changed. Hollywood had changed. The studio system Jack dominated had collapsed. Power now came from different sources. Agents, production companies, streaming services. Not moguls controlling vast studios. The estate remained valuable as real estate, as a trophy, as a piece of Hollywood history, but it no longer served the function Jack had built it for. It couldn't. The industry that made it necessary didn't exist anymore. So it became what estates eventually become, a museum of a specific moment, a physical artifact of a time when men like Jack Warner could control an industry from mansions in Beverly Hills. That time is gone. The estate remains. And the gap between what it was built for and what it is now tells the story of Hollywood's transformation as clearly as any film.
There's a question that haunts stories like Jack Warner's. Was it worth it? He got what he wanted. Built a studio, made hundreds of films, became one of Hollywood's most powerful men, lived in a mansion that impressed everyone who saw it. He also destroyed relationships with his brothers, estranged his son, died isolated from family, and lost control of the studio anyway. So was it worth it? The question assumes there was a choice, that Jack could have achieved some of his goals without sacrificing others, that he could have built Warner Bros. While maintaining family relationships, that he could have been successful without being ruthless. Maybe that's true. Maybe if he'd been different, more generous, more trusting, less obsessed with control, he could have had both. Or maybe not. Maybe the industry was so competitive, so brutal, that anyone who wasn't willing to betray family wouldn't have survived. Maybe Jack's ruthlessness was necessary, not incidental, to his success. We can't know. We only know what happened. What happened was Jack built an empire and a mansion. He produced films people still watch. He hosted parties people still talk about. He created something that outlasted him. He also died alone, estranged from his son, having skipped his brother's funeral, surrounded by luxury, but not by love. Both things are true. Both are part of his legacy. The estate embodies this duality. It's beautiful, genuinely beautiful. The architecture is elegant. The grounds are stunning. Walking through it, you can see why people were impressed. But it's also empty. Not physically. Subsequent owners have filled it with furniture and life. Empty of the meaning Jack tried to give it. Because the estate was supposed to prove Jack had made the right choices, that success justified everything, that power was worth any price. But buildings can't prove that. They can only demonstrate that someone had money to build them. The rest, the meaning, the justification, the worth, those have to come from somewhere else. And Jack didn't have anywhere else. He'd sacrificed the relationships that might have given meaning. He'd estranged the family that might have provided perspective.
He'd optimized entirely for success, as Hollywood defined it. So when he died, what remained was a mansion. Valuable, beautiful, impressive, but just a mansion. The question isn't whether it was worth it. The question is what worth it means. If it means money and power and cultural impact, then yes, Jack got what he paid for. If it means something else, connection, family, being known by people who love you rather than need you, then no, he paid far more than he received. The estate can't answer which definition matters more. It just stands there, 9 acres of beautiful ambiguity.
Sam Warner's death in 1927 haunts the entire story. Not because Sam would have changed anything fundamental about the studio or the industry, but because he was the brother who could mediate, who could keep Jack and Harry from destroying their relationship. With Sam alive, the fights would have continued. Jack and Harry would still have disagreed about spending, creative choices, studio direction, but Sam could have found compromises, could have reminded them they were family, not just business partners. Sam's death removed that possibility, and over the next 30 years, the fights escalated until Jack's betrayal made reconciliation impossible. Jack attended the premiere of The Jazz Singer instead of Sam's funeral. It's been debated for decades whether this was because Jack couldn't face the grief or because he prioritized the film. Probably both. Jack was devastated by Sam's death. By all accounts, Sam was his favorite brother. But Jack also understood that The Jazz Singer was the most important premiere of their careers, that the future of Warner Bros. Depended on it succeeding. So he made a choice: the work over the grief, the future over the past, the premiere over the funeral. And that choice set a pattern. Every subsequent time Jack faced a similar decision, family or career, relationship or power, he chose the same way. When he divorced Irma, he could have maintained a relationship with Jack Jr., could have been an active father despite the divorce. He didn't. He moved on with Anne and largely abandoned his son emotionally. When he betrayed Harry and Albert, he could have been honest with them, could have negotiated a different arrangement. He didn't. He tricked them and took sole control. When Harry had a stroke, Jack could have visited, could have apologized, could have tried to reconcile before Harry died. He didn't. He sent flowers to the funeral and stayed in Los Angeles. When he fired Jack Jr., he could have found a different solution, could have given his son real authority or helped him transition to another studio. He didn't. He pushed him out and minimized his inheritance. Every time, the same choice: work over family, power over connection, control over relationship. And every time, Jack built the estate a little bigger, added another feature, hosted another party, as if the mansion could fill the space left by the people he'd lost. It couldn't. Buildings don't replace people. Luxury doesn't substitute for love. Success doesn't heal the wounds ambition creates. But Jack kept building anyway, because what else could he do? Admit he'd been wrong? Acknowledge the cost? Face the emptiness? Easier to add a golf hole, expand the pool, host another party. Keep performing success until you die. The Warner Bros. Lot in Burbank still exists today. It's much larger than when the brothers founded it. More sound stages, more office buildings, more infrastructure. It produces television shows, films, and digital content for global audiences. But the brothers are gone. Their names remain on the studio entrance, Warner Bros., but none of their descendants control it. Jack sold it in 1967. The new owners merged it with other companies, renamed it, restructured it. Today, it's owned by Warner Bros. Discovery, a massive media conglomerate that bears the Warner name but has no Warner family involvement. The studio the brothers built from Nickelodeon's became too large for any one family to control. It became a corporation, then a conglomerate, then a piece of a larger entertainment empire. That was probably inevitable. Industries consolidate. Family businesses become public companies. Founders get bought out or pushed out. But there's something melancholy about it anyway. 4 brothers built something extraordinary, and within decades of their deaths, their family had no connection to it.
The estate in Beverly Hills followed a similar path, built by Jack, controlled briefly by Anne, then sold to a series of wealthy buyers who had no connection to Warner Bros. Or the brothers who built it. Both the studio and the estate became commodities, valuable because of their history, but divorced from the people who created that history. This is what happens to legacies. They get absorbed, recontextualized, sold and resold until the original meaning is lost and only the market value remains. Jack wanted to build something permanent, something that would outlast him and prove he'd mattered. He succeeded. The studio still exists. The estate still exists. Both are worth far more now than when he built them. But they're not his anymore. They're not Warner anymore. They're just valuable properties in an industry and city that moved on. Maybe that's the real dark story. Not the betrayals, those are personal tragedies, but the futility. The way even successful legacies get diluted and absorbed until nothing remains except names on buildings that most people don't think about. Warner Bros. Means movies to most people, not four brothers from Poland who built an empire from Nickelodeons, not the fights and betrayals and heartbreak, just movies. The Warner estate means luxury real estate to most people, not Jack's ambition or the parties or the relationships destroyed. Just a valuable property in Beverly Hills. The meaning Jack tried to create got replaced by market value. And market value, unlike meaning, is always temporary, always subject to reassessment. The estate will be sold again and again, each time to someone who cares less about Jack Warner and more about the property's location and amenities, until eventually, maybe, someone tears it down, builds something new, erases even the physical evidence of what Jack created. That hasn't happened yet. The estate still stands, but it will happen, eventually, because nothing lasts forever, especially not monuments to ego.
Stand in the Warner estate today, or imagine standing there, since it's a private residence, and try to feel what Jack felt. Pride, certainly. The mansion is genuinely impressive. The grounds are beautiful. The craftsmanship is excellent. Anyone would be proud of building something this substantial. But also, loneliness? Doubt? Regret? We can't know. Jack didn't leave introspective writings. He left business records and films and a property. What we do know is that he kept building, kept expanding, never seemed satisfied, never reached a point where he said, "This is enough. I have enough. I am enough." That suggests the building was compensation, not for poverty, he'd escaped that decades earlier, but for something else, some emptiness that luxury couldn't fill. Maybe it was the absence of the people he'd lost. Sam, dead at 40, Harry, estranged and dead, Jack Jr. pushed away. All of them gone because Jack chose power over relationship. Or maybe it was simpler. Maybe Jack was just ambitious. Some people are. They don't build to compensate for loss. They build because building is what they do. It's their nature, their drive, their purpose. If that's true, then the tragedy isn't that Jack sacrificed relationships for ambition. It's that ambition itself is a void. It's never satisfied, never complete. There's always another project, another acquisition, another expansion. So Jack built the estate over decades. Each addition was supposed to be the final one, the thing that would make it complete. But completion never came. Because the estate wasn't the point, the building was the point, the process of accumulating and expanding and demonstrating power. Once you finish, you have to confront the question, now what? Jack never had to confront that question. He died while the estate was still his, while he could still walk the grounds and remember who'd visited, what deals were made, what parties were hosted. He died believing he'd built something permanent that proved his life mattered. The irony is that the estate did outlast him. It does prove something, just not what Jack thought. It proves that even extraordinary success can't substitute for human connection, and that mansions can't fill the space left by estranged family, that legacy is cold comfort when you die alone. The estate stands, beautiful, valuable, empty of the meaning Jack tried to give it. And maybe that's what all monuments eventually become, evidence of ambition, proof of achievement, testimony to human capacity to build impressive things, but also reminders of what gets sacrificed, what gets destroyed, what gets left behind in the pursuit of permanency that turns out to be temporary anyway.
In September 1978, Jack Warner died at his estate in Beverly Hills. He was 86. He'd lived there for over 40 years, hosted thousands of guests, made hundreds of deals, built a monument to his success. And he died there largely alone. Anne was with him, medical staff, household employees, but his son wasn't there. His brothers were long dead. The studio he'd controlled had pushed him out. What he had was the estate. 9 acres, Georgian mansion, pool, golf course, tennis courts, everything he'd built to prove he'd succeeded. The estate couldn't comfort him, couldn't forgive him for the betrayals, couldn't restore the relationships he'd destroyed, couldn't change the choices he'd made. It was just a house. Grand, beautiful, expensive, but just a house. Jack's funeral was well attended. Hollywood turned out to honor one of its founding moguls, actors, directors, executives, people whose careers he'd shaped for better or worse. Jack Jr. attended. He'd been estranged from his father for years, fired from the family studio, minimized in the will, but he came to the funeral, unlike his father, who'd skipped Harry's funeral 20 years earlier. What Jack Jr. felt standing at his father's grave, we can't know. Grief? Relief? Anger? Probably all three. The emotions we feel toward people who hurt us and whom we love anyway are never simple. The Warner estate passed to Anne, then to Geffen, then to Murdoch, then to others. Each sale made news. Each new owner made changes. The estate continued to appreciate. But it's not the Warner estate anymore, really. It's just an estate in Beverly Hills. Valuable, historic, impressive, but disconnected from the man who built it and the industry he dominated. Warner Brothers still exists, still produces films and television, still employs thousands, still generates billions in revenue, but it's not a family business. It's a division of a media conglomerate. The brothers who built it are all gone. Sam since 1927, Harry since 1958, Albert since 1967, Jack since 1978.
What remains are stories about how 4 brothers from Poland built a Hollywood studio, about the transition to sound, about the betrayals that destroyed their partnership, about a mansion in Beverly Hills where legends gathered. The stories are true. They happened. The evidence exists in films, in business records, in the estate itself. But the people are gone. The relationships are gone. The specific texture of what it meant to be Jack Warner walking through his mansion at night, reflecting on what he'd built and what it cost. That's gone too. What we're left with is the aftermath. The estate, the studio, the films, the legend. And the question that won't quite resolve, was it worth it? Jack thought so. He defended his choices until he died, built his monument, lived in luxury, achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a poor kid in Ohio. But he also died estranged from his son, having skipped his brother's funeral, isolated from the people who'd known him before he was powerful. Both things are true. Both are part of the legacy. And the Warner estate stands as evidence of both. Beautiful and empty, impressive and hollow, a monument to success built on the ruins of family. The gates still stand. The mansion still rises white and elegant behind manicured gardens. The pool still reflects California sky. The golf course still rolls green across 9 holes. And somewhere in the halls, if you believe in such things, the ghosts of every choice Jack made gather. Every betrayal, every estrangement, every moment he chose power over love. The estate holds them all, not haunting it exactly, just present, embedded in the walls like memory in stone. Because that's what we build, not just houses, but containers for our choices, physical evidence of what we valued and what we sacrificed to get it. Jack valued success, power,
control, legacy, and he got all of it. What he didn't get, what he destroyed to achieve it, was family, connection, being known by people who loved him without calculation. The estate can't answer which mattered more. It can only stand there, permanent and empty, waiting for the next owner who'll value it for the property, not the history. And maybe that's the final irony. The thing Jack built to prove his life mattered became just another commodity, valuable, tradable, meaningless except as real estate. The doors close, the lights dim. The mansion sits quiet on its hill, holding all its contradictions without resolving any of them. Success and loneliness, achievement and isolation, power and emptiness.